Hi, Matt. It's great to have you back again.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks for having me back. It's good to see you.
So I'd like to just welcome everybody that again. So someone mentioned in the comments in our last conversation that I should at least give our names. So today I'm Karen and I'm talking to Matt, and we are going to be furthering our discussion of Iris Murdoch and an essay, a lecture, I guess, that she gave on the sovereignty of good. And it's been a fascinating read, very complex, and makes a lot of thoughts come to mind. And Matt, you had something you wanted to share with us today to kick us off.
So, Iris, and by the way, I'm coming to this conversation after having listened to you and Michael, and also from the Voxer threads, and at work, which is a combination of paper pushing, which is lovely, and reading through large data sets of law, which is also exciting. I meditated, and of course I'm meta about most things, so I became meta about meditation and went into a rabbit hole of what divided the Eastern and the Western church. And for my money, what split the church, the house, was, and maybe we could fit this into right, left brain, yin yang, chaos, order, but what split the house was contemplation and how to talk about it. And I think in talking about contemplation, we might also discuss language. Because certainly when one contemplates, I think they feel a utility in language that they wouldn't if they were passively reading or passively conversing with the friend the language that they were accidentally raised in. It's sort of like a monologue where language is reflecting itself. But contemplation, and then this other word, theosis, which is it's an ugly word. It means nothing. It's just stasis and theos, but it has in it this idea of a union with God. So if God is personal, what would it be, not mean, but what would it be to be united with him? And this is where my Kierkegaard comes in, maybe to your Barfield or whomever we wish to point to. This life, as I push my paper or speak to a human being, as I am in my skin, behind my eyes, what is it to strive for water that quenches forever? Right? Without the pretense and without rhetorical tropes, what is it if that were true and if that is real life? So
Okay, well, that fits right in with what I've been thinking about this week too, because I've been thinking about this very elemental principle that simplicity breeds complexity. But that necessitates that you start with simplicity. And because when you start with simplicity, it leaves room for infinite complexity. If you start with something that's already complex, you've narrowed your options significantly. And I find this fascinating. Last time when we were talking, you gave this very brief history of what a philosopher does, and I thought it was so helpful that for people that are new this time, I'm just going to read, I transcribed it, I'm just going to read this quote because it was very helpful to me. You leave commonly understood terms behind and battle the dragon of some eminent philosopher's definition of those terms, and then make your solution seem perfect because it fits the questions you were begging along the way and dropping like little breadcrumbs so that when you finally insert it, it seems inevitable. And I just thought, wow, that is so cool, because otherwise, it's such a great picture of what's happening with philosophy, because otherwise it's very hard to understand why one philosopher is always fighting back against other philosophers. And you know, trying to find their own niche and trying to find their own way forward. And there is certainly one way in which philosophy has had a massive impact on the world, because you can see how these great philosophical movements have transformed the direction of history, and why we find ourselves in the peril that we're in today because of some moves that were not so great in the, you know, philosophical endeavors. But there's another sense in which philosophers can get so wound up in all these complexities that if you're really trying to just help people have a better world, philosophy, you could come up with the greatest philosophy in the world, but if you can't articulate it to people so that their lives are changed, you don't get very far. So what tends to happen is that philosophers tend to grip the academic elite, and then they begin to pass it on to their students. And that's kind of the way change gets made. But maybe we're in a state today where we would like to find a way to communicate very simple, beautiful truths to people in general, rather than trying to wait for 50 or 60 years to get it through the universities. There may not be time for that, right?
If I may put a tag to what you just said, because I could not agree with you more, especially in your characterization, I would give it the word pretense. That I will install difficulty, and then when I die, legacy means in the ivory tower where people are paid to decipher my code and then disseminate in bright analogies and allegories the Chinese water torture of all the things they don't have to do in graduate school. You've built a cult where you have priests, you have a Levitical line of hierarchical, bureaucratic, and I don't mean that with a negative connotation, paperwork. But to your point, Jesus talked to the tax collectors and sinners on the street, and he gave them word pictures. And what was interesting to me is he didn't do what James Joyce did. And I think James Joyce had enough stripes on his back from preparatory school and learning 5 or 6 languages, left stripes on his tongue, so that when it came time to write, he said this somewhere in a journal, he intentionally made the work difficult by puns, riddles, gnomic sayings, involution, and this is the quote from his journal, so that I can have the professors guessing for years. Because to your point, that's what immortality meant in a literate age, was making it not obvious on the page, but a shattered loaf, not the Eucharist. So now I'm starting to free associate. Not a Eucharist, not a joining of bread and wine, not a consumption, not a digestion, not a whole body participation in Peugeotian terms. No symbol. Rather, a lot of, for lack of a better word, evasions and gnomic sayings. I go back to this, where no word means what it does on the face of it. And I think philosophy maybe, in at least the 20th century, with its emphasis on syntax and semantics and linguistic structures, Chomsky, other people, where they have to devise rules of interpretation before you can begin to read their texts. So it's creating a feedback loop of, oh, we must be getting closer to what they mean. And this here's a word, centripetality is a cult, is cultic. But I remember when I was at the Bay Area and I was outside because I wanted to take things traditionally. And my priest said, well, you're a catechumen, which means you cannot partake of the Eucharist, the body and the blood. And 2,500 years, or excuse me, 1,500 years ago, the catechumens would be dismissed before you could, and you and your brothers and sisters, you and the Lord would go and eat together the body and the blood. Our eyes were not sufficiently graced to see this. And I thought I would take him at his word, because nowadays they don't do this, but I thought I would take him at his word. So I left and I went to a anteroom with a dividing wall between the iconostasis, our contemporaries, and a barred window. And I stood at the barred window and I could hear through the wall the hymns and the priestly prayer over the bread and the wine. And I waited, and this is the sort of thing we might get to now. No proposition came to tap my shoulder. No sort of infused light came with a special revelation. But, and I can't put this into words, it's ineffable, God came. And I was transported back to when it made sense to excuse the catechumens. And I felt the awe as they were eating on the other side of the wall, what it has always meant. And I cried, but they weren't tears of sorrow or pity or the sort of thing that you run to an altar with. It was joy creating sorrow. And then it left, and it was just a window and bars again. And nothing changed. I don't think an atom was made into something that is not an atom, but I was united. It was wonderful. Now, in terms of how do you didactically teach someone something, I would like to turn that on its head, because I love the way, and you did this on Voxer, you talk about seeing. I think you're so good at this. You take a mathematical concept and you're precise about the parameters of it. And then and I think one of the reasons you are precise with the parameters of it is you make that a thing you build with vocabulary, and then you let it sit. And I notice you do this with your interviewers sometime. You then wait to see what they'll do with it. Is that intentional, or like,
well,
is it didactic? Is it more, let's experiment? Like, how do you see it? Not to put you on the spot.
No, I wouldn't say that it's intentional. I have in my mind, I have this big picture of what I think is happening. And I think this is probably true of, when I was listening to a video of Iris Murdoch talking to some British interviewer about the differences between literature and philosophy. It was an old video, probably from the 70s. And she was talking about what it means to be a philosopher and the way your mind works and everything. I never, ever thought of myself as a philosopher. But as she was talking, I thought, that's kind of what's been gripping me the last couple of years, is I have a question that has gripped me. And that question has started to build an edifice in my brain that things fit into as I hear them. So when I'm trying desperately to explain to somebody, the picture is so big, I can't grab hold of it. So when I'm trying to explain an aspect of it to somebody, the only way I can explain it is to take out a little piece of that edifice and illustrate it, either mathematically or with some kind of a framework, so that you can get a little picture, a little window of what I'm trying to say. And the reason it's so hard to describe is that much of what I see is based on my own internal experience of what it's like to paint a picture. That's something I can't give to anybody. I can't offer that experience over to anybody. I really can't explain it in words, just as you can't explain that experience in the narthex in words, right? But I think this is what we need to begin passing on to people, is this importance of action. that it's okay, and these are all cliches. They're just cliches, but it's living out the reality of good. It's not thinking about what is good, but it's living the reality of good. I was reading, somebody mailed me this book for free. It's called The Biggest Lie in the History of Christianity. Very thin little book. I read it in about an hour. And it's really quite a brilliant small book. It's very, very simple. But simplicity leaves a lot of space, right, for something to happen. And his idea, he talks about many of the lies that are told about Christianity and gives a brief summary of why those lies are not true. And then he says, but the biggest lie is that holiness is not possible. Because that's a lie that Christians tell themselves. And that's a lie that the church tells us, that holiness is really not possible. And he says, I'm going to prove to you that holiness is possible. Do you think that you could be holy for just a moment? Just one moment. And think about what a holy moment would be. Now, that moment you were in the narthex, that was a holy moment. There have been times when I'm in the middle of a song, a worship song at church, and I'll just be like, I'll be gripped by some thought that's in the song, and that thought will transport me to some place and it's just like all the glory of heaven just spills into my soul. I'm not in charge of that at all, right? That's a holy moment. But it's equally a holy moment when I'm kind of irritated with my husband, but instead of being irritated with him, I ask the Lord for grace and I go make him a cup of coffee and I take it to him when he hasn't asked for it. Okay, that's a holy moment. It's a holy moment if...
Muted.
I got muted?
Yeah. The last thing I heard was you brought a cup of coffee to your husband when he didn't ask for it.
Yeah. Okay, so it would also be a holy moment if one of the examples he used in the book was of a man who found out that his neighbor 3 doors down, whom he had never met, had broken his leg. So when he finished mowing his own lawn, he went down and mowed that guy's lawn. Unasked, just to do it, you know? These are holy moments. And we could start a movement of executing holy moments, as many as we can handle, you know, one moment at a time, because sometimes those moments get multiplied and turn into movements that change the world. But even if they don't, if as many people as possible were living out holy moments every day, the world would be transformed. And
I think
he has a lot of good practical examples in there. But I think the reason I liked it is just this idea of it's the lived experience, but it's not for personal benefit. It's the lived experience for the benefit of others. And it changes you. It changes you fundamentally. In the same way that your experience in the narthex, yes, in one way, nothing changed. In another way, everything changed inside of you, right?
What should we make of this together? Because my heart sings to what you said, but then I'm filled with that dread that has to be addressed. And I would characterize it this way. Suppose we will live forever. You and I spoke about an infinite potential known as the afterlife. And a soul without the body no longer has these wonders of snapping the finger, pouring the cup of coffee, moving the blades of the lawnmower ahead. And so the state it leaves is the state it is. And to come to God that way. One thing I don't see, and I have no good reason for using this word other than I'm pulling from my autobiography. So it's one of those long magician, multicolored strips and bands out. I wish I could get rid of it, but it's my past. One Protestant emphasis, one Protestant element that I think is not sufficiently paradoxed is love thy neighbor. Because, and I think I was disciplined by Kierkegaard to say this, whether it's right or wrong. We can spend our whole lives assisting, benefacting, nursing to our damnation.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because in 10 billion years, the cup of coffee, what is its value? In 10 billion, see, notice the atheist argument. Well, if we will die in a heat death in a billion plus trillion years, what does good matter and what does evil matter? But the same sort of thinking holds for perfection and God. Here's where I'm going with this. I think, as you said, with simplicity, there's more room. So let me just go straight to the end note. I've been going through this Divine Eros by Saint Symeon, the New Theologian. It's a collection of hymns back in 1000 AD. Who's polemical, who's a monk with an attitude and many arguments against the established order within the hieromonk orders. And one thing he said that wasn't popular among his brothers was personal vision is the deepest stamp of authentic Christianity. And that for him, that involved seeing the uncreated light and experiencing uncreated energies. And that had, and he was a recluse, a hermit. He never went to another person's yard. There seems to be an indulgence in that, but also there seems to be a humility. And maybe we could negotiate that with respect to eternity.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So what I see there is that let me go back just a second to something that was in the Iris Murdoch book. She's talking about the debate between empiricism and rationalism. And I think this fits because I had to go back and look up the definitions of those two because I had a vague idea but not very clear, so I looked up a definition. Empiricism says that sense experience is the ultimate source of all our concepts and knowledge. Rationalism says that concepts and knowledge are gained independently of sense experience. Now that seems like a polar opposite, right? So we have this polar issue going on. We talked some about polarity in my last talk with Michael.
I followed that closely. Mm-hmm.
And I was trying to get a grip on exactly what it is that Coleridge and Barfield were saying about polarity. And I don't want to go into that right now because that's mind-bending. But I did think about this empiricism and rationalism, and it seems to me that since I believe that both the sense experience and the rational thought are essential, but as in the polar opposite of men and women, there's an intended marriage. So the marriage of those two, and how does a marriage work out? A marriage only, I think marriages work out best when you have husband and wife, and then they're both looking to God. So the closer the husband draws to God, and the closer the wife draws to God, the closer the husband and wife get to each other on their little triangle, my little mathematical expressions, right? So you have empiricism and rationalism, and they seem to be in a tension with each other. But as the two of them are drawn up into the goodness of being, drawn closer to that, then they are closer to each other in essence. So both empiricism and rationalism have this marriage that's going on. And the marriage is better than either one of them would be independently, because marriage fuses the strengths of each other, but it also diffuses the weaknesses of each other.
Good point.
Okay. So,
and then next to those words as synonyms, because I this week have been thinking about these two turns of phrases in church history, but they map onto what you did with empiricism and rationalism. So on the empiricist side, in, say, church terminology, particularly in how monks would use it, how the universities would have used it. And this essentially brings us full circle to what does it mean to say, without propaganda or agenda, something that can be passed down? Well, the shorthand for it is make an image. But then you have the problem of deciphering the image, or as we talked in the last video, being gathered up into it while simultaneously bringing it down to where you are and your neighbors, the one who has a broken leg, and what to do about that ethically. So on the empiricist side, there's a Greek word used by, and I'm going to use St. Symeon again in his first hymn, where he talks about the uncreated energies, which are acts of God in the world. So when I was standing in the narthex, the light that was not light was an energy, I believe, from the personal God. And the belief wasn't an assent of my mind, A-S-S-E-N-T. It was a slight, gradual ascent, A-S-C-E-N-T, of my heart to my mind, and my mind descending to my heart. It was an action, in other words. But faith was active. Though someone walking by would have seen a tall, slender, lonely man looking out the window with poignancy. But it could not be further from the truth. But it would take too long, and I would become prosaic in trying to sit them down and explain didactically what was happening to me. And 3/4 of the way in, they wouldn't believe my report. Mm-hmm. So we have this inhospitability to conveying our subjective communion with God. And yet we are ordered to love one another, and we are given pictures of the vine and the body as if it was already achieved. And so language becomes this runoff, really. I don't think it's much spade work. It's more of a runoff. It's and maybe that's why in some orders they don't even speak. They vow silence. That doesn't stop the energies. But so with the empiricist, the word that Mr. St. Symeon used was taken from the Greek word for aesthetics, aesthesis. And what it means is to cut through. And then the other half of it is to size up. So to cut through and size up in this compound word of aesthesis, where we get aesthetics. And I mean, go to any rom-com and you see one half of the relationship cutting the other to size. And that's humorous, and it's turns of phrase. But aesthetically, that's what our senses are doing all the time. Breaking down the particles, receiving in the light. We constrict. And to use your phrase, we take the complexity of all that is created, and through our senses, literally cut off 99.99% and bring it to size for whatever reason. Empiricism. And then the other one rationalism was their word theoria, where we get theory. And they used that not as a, here I'm going to write down my 7 propositions to explain how to always cut through and what size to bring it up towards, so that next time you use a $500 million machine, you'll find what I found. And we can correlate these things and iterate our experiments and have a standard model. No, it was after having some clarifying, I'm sorry to throw out all these words, but I think it's useful. After having this clarifying catharsis. So Aristotle would say, go to a play, see a tragedy, and then gasp with pity and awe. That you're literally, something's coming out of you that was there, which the choreographed and no accidents on stage performance is inducing aesthetically. It's cutting out all the other irrelevant data. And as a production, bringing your perceptions up to size. And when you see that, it's like God seeing what he made. It's me. And of course, you know, we critique everything we see because it's not quite there yet. It proves that we have independent souls. It's very important going to cinema. And yet, when we do this theoria, after we've had this clarifying vision, he says we have nepsis, and he takes Peter in the gospel epistle where he says, be watchful for Satan, and then he introduces an image for cathartic purposes. It's like a roving lion waiting to pounce. And so you get the full stack of implications. Your attention has been narrowed, and now you know what it means to fear the adversary. So it puts you out of catharsis into this nepsis, this watchfulness. And they called that sobriety in this world. And there's a prayer that says, let me get through the night of this day. In a sense of the moment you're saved, and this relates to, do I go across the street and mow the lawn for my neighbor or not? I don't see a well-tended neighborhood. I'm not in a safe place. It's irrelevant if I'm in LA or Maine. The whole thing is just me walking through in a sober way this night, watchful. Because like Peterson, all I care about is where that snake is. I think Peterson got nepsis from these Orthodox people or whomever, refracted. Because he says that, right? Take an aim, but be watchful. Always pay attention. Nepsis. So you have this moment with a piece of art, clarifies your senses. And after that, you're expected to be sober. Don't go to the junk entertainment anymore. You have to be watchful because something could take your joy or intellect from you, your discovery from you. It could make little of it. It could betray you. And that's asceticism or an exercise. And then somewhere along the way, you have a theory land on your lap as of grace. And that is this communion with God, where the person next to you, never mind they're not sober. Never mind that they're not thinking about that cathartic experience that happened to them when they were 12 or when they went to the Louvre or when they painted, as you pointed out, and they were in the flow state. All that as prerequisite isn't there. So when you're like it's starting to happen, they look at you and say, is anybody home? Oh, is anybody home? If only I could tell you who is home. So empiricism and rationalism, I think we're mapping together.
Yeah, well, so what I see happening here is I want to step back just a second and go back to the example of the guy who mowed the lawn for his neighbor, because I don't want that to be misunderstood as that was one example of what it means to be in a holy moment, but that was just one example. Any action that we take that is in accordance with God's will for us, whatever that action might be, however simple or however complicated, when we move into that moment, that's a holy moment. The minute that I obey, so even if my obedience is like the guy writing the book about the hymns from the year 1000, right? He was walking in obedience. His whole life was probably a holy moment. But for those of us who are just plain simple folk without the monastic life, we have to find ways to live out holy moments in our days, not because it does good for somebody else. That's part of it, because that does make a better world. And of course, you always want to be sure that when you're moving in this holy moment, that you are actually desiring the best for the other, not just doing it because, you were talking about the dread of what might happen if we're always acting out of this kindness and compassion. If our compassion is all wound up in making me feel good about myself, then I'm actually on the way to hell and not on the way to heaven, right?
Or if we don't take our own souls seriously, which is another way of saying not taking our sin seriously.
Yes.
Like, is my sin just that I don't think often enough about my neighbor? I think that's the cherry on top of my sin. Like the deep, like where the chocolate goes down, the dregs, it's strange. We think we're better than God. Like we have this pride over the infinite and transcendent. And it takes us many months to crystallize our phonemes. And yet we do it. We have this immaculate pride. So, and that to your point, as you clarified, I also want to clarify, I mean that we don't sit with ourselves and see the embers of all that went wrong and can go wrong and does go wrong. Because it's easier to put a smile on someone else's face. It can be, because it might not take much. And that may be a temptation. Well, if I just call them, because literally, like nowadays, I could take my phone and every 3 minutes call someone and wish them a good day. But it would be a spiritual distraction if I use it to not ever face myself. But to your point, maybe someone needs to do that. Who knows? It's their prerogative and conscience. But go ahead.
Well, this goes back to the discussion we were having last time when you said you thought maybe Peterson had missed something in his idea of attention and of following your interest. If your interest causes you to set up camp in the middle of Seattle and try to create your own village, right? But the thing that I don't think we ever got around to talking about is that when Jordan Peterson is talking about that, fixing your gaze on the highest possible good and orienting your life around that, that means that when you think about that, when you think about taking action, that your action is good for yourself now and in the future, all the way through. And that action is also good for your immediate family in the now and in the far future. That your action is also good for your community in the now and in the future. So your action can't be just strictly your own goal. And I mean, that's why he always says you have to clean your own house first before you go out and try to change the world. I'm guessing that those folks that built the CHOP thing had not taken care of cleaning their rooms first. And of course, cleaning your room has within it, here's the cool thing I like about that cleaning your room picture, because it's not just actually cleaning your room, although that is it, because cleaning your room is a way of contemplating. Because just sitting in a corner and contemplating, you can build fantasy worlds up inside your head. But if you're cleaning your room and you're contemplating, who am I based on the way that this room has been and on the way that I want the room to be, and where have things gone wrong in my life, and why have I ended up here? And you're contemplating all those things as you are acting, right? So you're building and acting at the same time that you're contemplating, and you're coming to recognize all of your failures and the darknesses. And I mean, I don't usually come to aha moments about my sin when I'm just sitting in a chair thinking about things. It's usually when I recognize something in an experience or in a relationship or in a moment of action, when I go, oh boy, that was 100% me all the way, you know. And I see my own sinfulness. I see my missing the mark. I see my pride. I see my trying to put myself in God's place, all of that kind of thing. I see that when I'm acting. So it seems to me that the action, what we're missing a lot of, I think, especially, I don't know about the Eastern Church, but in the Protestant Church, what we're missing a lot of is the acting out. We're more into what we think about, or, you know, how we share things with each other or whatever, rather than actually the lived experience of, and that's the way, that's why I really like this idea of anomaly, is that because every time we come up against an anomaly, we have to act. You don't have a choice when you confront an anomaly. You're thrown into chaos. You're thrown into the deep end of the pool. When I was 5 years old, my dad got the idea that he could teach me to swim by throwing me into the Mediterranean off the side of the ship, and that I would figure it out. I still remember the feeling. Now,
what was it like to fall into that chaos?
I mean, at first I was terrified, but I did figure out a way to paddle around and kind of keep myself above water. And then, of course, they finally came in and got me. And I think I had some resentment towards him for many years afterwards. But that's the kind of thing. It is a great picture for me now. Whenever I think about, you know, Jordan Peterson says, when chaos opens up, you're thrown in there. You've got to do something, right? You got to act. And it's in the acting that you learn, because that's where all the new information is. The new information isn't inside my head. It's in whatever new experience I'm going to have in the next moment. What's inside my head is available information, but it's not new information. I can work on it. I can build things out of it. But if I'm going to get new information, it's going to come out of confronting hardship, suffering, anomaly.
So I agree with what you said. And at the same time, it's as if there's this ray of darkness coming out of a closet door, and I have to open it to our dialogue, which is, yes, philosophically in the 20th century, the mind has been hijacked as a entity and reconceptualized in description as this machine that's pretty good at deciphering code. You run Karen's analogy of being tossed in the Caribbean or Mediterranean, if I misremembered, but my machine brain will still make an association with another body of water. I will see the attendant images or close enough, and then spit out a sympathy or a interpretation that is congruent to whatever we're doing. And as Peterson would say, is useful enough to get going with whatever this is, whatever this has for us to discover. And I mean, they've been at each other's throats about just how efficient the machine is, if we can go in there and change things, if we can model it at all. Richard Rorty in Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature in the 70s said, we can't come up with any good picture of the machine. So we should demolish epistemology, because we can't even build a model, let alone the model. Philosophers love to do that, right? Like Heidegger did that. We don't even know what being means. So let's undo hundreds of years of conversation and go to first principles. And I agree, that has been done. That pulling the rug out from underneath has happened to the mind time and time again, and it's infected discourse. So with that said, that's why I agree so much with what you're saying when you said get out of our heads, because it has been co-opted by all these other discourses. But at the same time, that ray of darkness from the closet door is, I don't think the mind, and I'm not saying you said this, but to introduce another topic, the mind does not exhaust subjectivity. There are other interiors. And one of those compartments is the heart. And they're not the same thing. And I think people, and this might be our treasure, our boon, not many philosophers have taken up a systematics of the heart. They've done it for the mind, Descartes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the heart, whereas be still and know that I am God. What's the sense of still in that command? Is he speaking to the body, the mind, the heart? I don't know, but it's got, what do you do, especially from, and I really would love to hear you speak on this from what you meant earlier by when I sit and paint. I was having a visceral reaction to that because I know it's important. You painting and how you interact with that. It's for you, it's creatio ex nihilo, right? Because you have nothing, and then you create, and you're bringing prior principles and technique, and you're also talking it through as if it was a philosophical scheme with primary colors, composites. You get vibration, like you said in the boxer. So maybe run that through with this thing I pointed out of the heart. Like, how do you make the heart make sense to yourself?
That's why I paint. Because I can't make my heart make sense to myself. Although I have to say that this project of being on YouTube and talking to people about things has substantially made a difference in that. Because I had many years in which I couldn't articulate a lot of these ideas. And I'm not exactly sure why that was. I think part of it might have been that I was really busy with life up until the time I'm about 45 years old, and then I had a baby at the age of 46, which is a kind of challenging time to have a baby. So from 46 until about 50, I'm talking baby talk and nothing over 4 or 5 letters, you know, and I sort of lost the ability to communicate any sort of complex ideas, and that's when I started painting, because I needed some way to offload some of whatever was going on inside of me. But the experience of painting, I think the reason I brought that up earlier is that once I learned all these elements and principles of design, and that was over the course of years, because I mean, the first time I learned it in a 10-week class, but I didn't really learn it. I just began to use it. I began to use what I had learned, and then I used it and used it and used it. And they say you have to do at least a couple thousand paintings before you get to where you've internalized it. And I suppose I feel like maybe I started to internalize it once I got up around 400 or 500 paintings, where these elements and principles were internalized enough that I no longer had to think about them when I painted. I could just paint. I had freedom. So the discipline of working within that structure created this immense freedom where I could just paint without having to think about stuff at all. And that's when I felt like interesting things started to happen, because then I was just in a space where I was, I don't know, I can't put it into words really. But these elements and principles are so compelling in, let me just give you an example. I wrote some of this down the other day because I thought this would be a interesting way to look at the problem of polarity. If I can find it. I have too many things here. Oh, here it is. Okay. I was talking about how simple rules produce complexity. So there are 7 elements and 8 principles. And I'm just going to run through the 7 elements really quick. Line, size, shape, direction, color, value, and texture. Now, if you think about it, a line can be short or long. You got this end, you got that end, right? A shape can be large or small. A shape can be simple or complex. Direction can be right or left, up or down, catty corner. A color can be warm or cool. It can be bright or dull. It can be dark or light. It can be smooth. The texture can be smooth or rough. So you have all these polarities going on. Well, the beautiful thing that does is those are very, very simple polarities. But in between, there's an infinite line of complexity that's available to you. It's like do calculus with that polarity, right? And divide it up into however many pieces that you want. You can find someplace along that line. So every time you make a choice as an artist, you know how on the internet, on your computer, it'll say you have 256 million colors available to you when you're looking at color. Well, it's the same with paint. I mean, I'm sure there's an infinite number of colors possible to mix when you're mixing paint. So every time you put down a brush load, you're making a choice, and you're making that choice out of this infinite field of complexity in the whatever texture you're applying and whatever direction your lines are going, and if they're thick or thin, and or if they're scraggly or pure, you're making choices all the time. Well, your choices have to be defined by something. There has to be some higher principle that your choices are defined by. Well, okay, so you have the elements and principles of design, but even those provide, they're part of what creates this field of complexity for you that you don't know what to do with. So there has to be something beyond that. Now, maybe it is strictly your rationality. Maybe it is strictly, your own aesthetic sense. Maybe it is strictly your own theories of how something should look. Or maybe there's something outside of me that I can focus on, that I can think about. And
is this the anomaly for you, metaphysically? Or is anomaly
no, I think for me, the anomalies show up in the paint. Mm. Like I'll start painting, and I'll be painting, and there's like, what is that thing on my canvas? I don't like that thing. What can I do with it? Or maybe there's something on there that's so beautiful, and maybe it just happened by accident, some little treasure over in one corner. And they'll say to you as an artist, they'll say, if you have a place that's too precious on your canvas and it doesn't fit with the rest of the canvas, you've got to just get rid of it. You got to paint it out and keep going, because you're not working all about that one little perfect thing. You're trying to get the whole canvas to come, into a.
We can do a little jiving together now, as if you brought an electronic keyboard and I brought some CDs, because what maps onto what was so beautifully described as you put it, because as you said, it's in you, like all of that language, which really is diagnostic language. Mm-hmm. Like through the gnosis, you're using those words as a carpenter uses numbers. Like they are you speak them, and they speak your skill. So it was a pleasure to hear. And of course, then it generated associations within me, because I've given 2,000 hours to something else. But with its particular line, there are resonances with your line. And so there's a saint, his name is Saint Isaiah, the solitary. And near the end of his life, he said, and someone wrote down, and I want to say this in light of what you had said about, you've got to remove the precious things. As Hemingway said, kill your darlings, and you move on to the next painting and the next. And I kept thinking, yeah, this is the sobriety after a catharsis of, these are the principles. These are the things I can find infinite complexity in these binaries arranged. now I have to put in my 10,000 hours, as we would say nowadays, and go through painting after painting after painting, because it's not about this or that one. It's about going through them all and changing myself and having a transformed mind. St. Isaiah said, one sentence, God requires of us that we go on repenting until our last breath. I don't know how they did it, but synesthetically, every word in that sentence aligns with a sense on the body until the last one is the Hebraic, I don't know the word for it, but breath, which was their word for spirit. So our spirit was the breath that came out of us, and like a candle flickering, that's all we are in our temporality. Our last breath repents, and when it goes out, it's a form of ultimate repentance, change of state. And this painter going through and removing the preciousness and not staking their oeuvre on any one style or surrealism, right? Their particular philosophy of the surreal was inspiring to me. And these saints that come about, I'm trying to figure out why I'm obsessed with saints. And I think it's aesthetically they find me, not so much piously, right? I'm not so enamored by the fact that Saint Symeon or Saint Isaiah chose the monastic route, because nowadays this is not open to most people. And yet, with books like White Fragility and all these other things in the New York Times, I'm seeing culture become religious. We are post-literary, and we are now entering the theocratic age. Everything that has money, anything that has power is theological. And so when you talked about putting in your 10,000 hours, I think that harmonizes with what we've been trying to say. If I understood you correctly, you have to act. You can't sit and think. And yet, if your why act all this? It's to get in that state where you realize it's not about, well, in my case, I'm writing this sentence, I'm going to finish this novel. It's, no, I'm doing this so surreptitiously so that I can become what? What's the saintly form of a novelist? What's the saintly form of a painter? We don't know yet, but it's Christ, and has to do with the incarnation. And it really boggles my mind that we are made in the image of God. So what do you do with that concept, that notion as a...
Well, I want to go back to your quote, because I thought that was a great quote.
Yes.
God requires of us that we go on repenting until our last breath. Now, there would be a lot of people who would hear that and would go, oh, what a dark view of life. That's so somber. That's so, you're just trying to take all the fun out of life. But I mean, that's not the way I see it at all, because for me, repentance is always that moment when more of me drops away and I get more of God and less of me. Because repenting is turning away from my own selfishness, turning away from my own, the ball and chain that I drag around, all the garbage. You've got your you've got your magic scarves. I've got my ball and chain that I'm hanging around, dragging around with me. I think that's from Hebrews. Can't remember where that is in Hebrews, but he's talking about letting go of the weight that's dragging you down, just the old garbage that you carry around with you all the time, letting go of that. Whenever I let go of some of that and I turn back to the Lord, so that's that repentance, and that's the most joyful moments. Those are the moments of transcendence. Those are the moments that the light breaks through, right? So to keep on keeping on with that until my last breath, that's the path to joy. That's the path to glory. And so I think that's that's a very hopeful, very joyful quote in my mind.
And I want to connect it to your holy moment concept you drew. Because I think, as Kierkegaard said, you can have the sublime and the pedestrian. I think we can do both. What I heard from you was the aspirational quality of the Christian life, or of a life seeking a transcendent, to put it in Petersonian terms. The highest ideal one can conceive of will at least have this aspirational quality of good for society, good for family, good for your brother, as you pointed out. And then maybe with this, there's this sense of, and yet nihilism creeps, and nihilism whispers, and nihilism looks up from the bottle. Even if it's water, it reminds you what alcohol can do. And I remember when I was in Grover Beach, California, working at Chili's, and I was in the back room next to the dishwasher, and the manager 5 minutes ago had said, "You might be a manager someday." And I looked down and I walked away, and I went to this large wash bin, and I talked as I was washing my hands, because I knew nihilist that I thought I had put away and repented from in Lincoln, Nebraska, working for Verizon, came back. I would say I was given a reminding image of the icon I am not. And by the grace of God, someday through Christ I will be. But along the way, this inadequacy spoke up from the water, and didn't actually speak, but metaphorically. And I addressed it. I addressed myself, and I said, under my breath, "You will not destroy me." And I was addressing the nemesis, right? The shadow figure in us. And because everything in me wanted to run away, not accept responsibility. In other words, any weight. I didn't want my body to feel reality. I wanted to be a no-name alias of this last name Allison, Anglo-Saxon. And if I didn't know how to address myself as the prodigal son finally coming to himself next to the pods that the pigs were eating, I could not have walked back to my manager and said, "Bring it on. Let's do this." And little did I know the whole place was underwater. We had been under budgeted for 13 years, and we were going to be closed down within a month. But God didn't reveal that to me. He just let me have a choice, and I came at it willingly. With faith, as prodigal son returned to his father, thinking he was going to have a promotion. So yes, we need to act, but we also have to be confident that our bodies are not bad, that our last name is not trivial. And and I'm really just speaking of myself. This is the most difficult thing in my battle with my passions, is to not hate, right? Every little thing I can see about myself. Oh, and it comes in the form of envy. Oh, if only I could know this person. If only I was at that person's house. If only I had this pleasure. Well, why can't I? I can write this poem and send it. Why can't I receive? Or I have this money. Why can't I? Or whatever it may be. And for myself, that envy is a form of self-loathing, and it's like deep spiritual hatred. And yet it's within those moments that you carve a lot of space. In that self-destruction, you carve so much space. And then, this is very presumptuous, but for me, the God comes and he makes use of all of that. It's strange. And that's why earlier I called it joy creating sorrow. Like, there is despondency and there is shame, which are evil. Like, no one should suffer those things even a minute. But sorrow, that can be good. And I don't quite yet know the difference, but I know the difference. I've experienced both.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's, you're describing so well what it's like to walk through the Christian life. And I remember when I was a really new Christian, I was a state legislator, and I got invited to a conference in Washington, D.C. for the new crop of state legislators. And so I went off to this conference, and I met a whole bunch of other state legislators who were kind of the same philosophical bent that I was, political bent that I was. So I'm you know, and I was not a Christian at this time, but, oh yeah, I had just become a Christian. So I'm at this table, and there's all these people sitting around the table, and I got engaged in a conversation with a guy who was a state legislator from New York. And we were having a great conversation, and in the course of the conversation, it came out that I was Christian. I was telling him, I mean, I was really excited about my faith. That was my thing. So I was really talking about it. And then I said something to him like, and really the most amazing thing is that I'm so much more aware of my sin now than I was before I became a Christian. You know, I really had no idea about all the sin that was in me until I made that decision. And he said, well, then I definitely don't want it, because I know enough about my own sin already. But I wonder about those things. But anyway, what you're describing is so much what the experience is of just letting some of these things peel off of us. You know, I mean, there's 15 different thoughts in my mind at one time. We'll just tackle one. So this thing that's in you that you see that just you find repulsive and dark and all of that, and you want to be rid of it. And then comes the sorrow, because you recognize that the distance that means between you and God. For me, I think over time, I came to recognize that, yes, that there's an infinite number of layers of that stuff inside of me. You know, I don't know that I'll ever get to the bottom of it. But the thing that took away the darkness, I mean, okay, it's still repellent, but it's not the same somehow, because now I recognize that no matter how many of those layers I get off, there's still an infinite distance between me and God. You know what I'm saying? That the
Yes.
infinite distance between me and God never changes, no matter how much I do. And that's perfectly all right. And that's why he reaches down to pick me up. But it's the process of working on those things, of letting him peel those layers away, you know, like Eustace in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, just letting God peel all that stuff away. It's that sort of painful, sorrowful, beautiful process that enables me to get more and more vulnerable and more transparent, right?
Oh God, great word for it. Yes. Great word for it. Transparent. Transparent, like an image to its creator. Ah, yes, this is it. And yet the creator leans in because it's not quite. And that leaning in is a loving lean. And LIEN, they put a lien on the rest of their life, because get back, it's not done yet. And they become, they experience a reciprocal narrowing. And this is the Trinity. I mean, the essence of God is in darkness. No one will ever know it. God is unspeakable. But his energies, that's our grace. So we're given in language to know God has three hypostases, three persons, three faces. And they're always, there's no sense of time. They've never taken their eyes off each other. They don't do anything because they are love. The Father and the Son never take their eyes off each other. The Holy Spirit forever proceeds from the Father, and the Son is all the acts of God. And this is the beauty. I said earlier, they don't do anything. Well, he spoke and it was. And just like a word leaving our mouth, I think this is one of the proofs for immortality that Socrates might have used. The immortality of the soul. When you speak, what leaves your mouth? A bunch of air, a certain vibrato. Where's the word? it's here. I mean, I point to this part of my skin, but that's not where the word is. Where'd the word go? Did it ever leave? It's everywhere. It's at least now in two places where it was one. In the same way, if you're standing by a fire and you put a stick in the fire and you remove the stick, now there are two fires. There's a separation without diminution. And so when Jesus was standing before his disciples in John's gospel and they said, just show us the Father and it is enough. He said, have I been so long with you? When you see me, you see the Father. I and the Father are one. The same voice at the beginning of Genesis, as Peterson would say, in pre-cosmogonic order, spoke through potential into actuality all that is and called it good. That was the Father seeing the Son and the Son seeing the Father, right, in that Trinity. And the word of truth going forth is the Holy Spirit. And all that to say, when he then said, let us make man in our image, and then being called to perfection, as you pointed out, in so many ways. Like the grace note of love and how we see God in certain moments, and God sees us and leans into it, and yet reciprocally narrows down. And yet that reciprocal narrowing down to a point explodes into infinity because you can't measure a dot. And that's that infinite distance between, and yet, like you said, it is infinite, and so it's not even an inch long. It's infinitely close. And like
when I said distance,
yeah.
you knew that I meant between my goodness and his goodness.
Oh, actually, no, I heard it as I didn't hear it as a moral thing. I heard it as something ontological, actually. But go ahead with what you were doing. Or
between my smallness and his largeness, or,
mm-hmm.
whatever paradigm you want to use.
Yeah.
But I wasn't talking about distance, because he's as close to me as breathing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's amazing when you pointed out the complexity, simplicity, that with simplicity you have more room. Like, compared to a rock, God is infinite, right? Because a rock is minerality. It's not much more than that. It's very simple. Well, so how are we any different from the rock in God's eyes? He set us apart as this thing he was making to image himself. And so how is it not 100%? That's strange, because I don't know. Obviously, I know subscript 2 that I'm nothing like God, to your point. I mean, infinitely sinful, and I am dust. Literally, I'm the stuff from the wood when you chop, the spray in the air. That's what he made me out of. And yet, what is it? So it's not any of the forces. It's not the binaries of long or short, complex or simple, down the line, that separate me from a rock and make me closer to God than any of the vegetation. I think certain people in the past have said it's our moral sense. I don't think that actually means anything, because morals are sociocultural.
Well, let's go back to the thing about seeing.
Yeah.
Because you were saying that the Father always sees the Son. Okay. So he made us in his image. Jesus Christ is the image also of the Father. That's what it says in Colossians 3 something, I think, or 1:15, something like that. Jesus Christ is the image of the invisible God. God made us in his image. If God is always looking at the Son, then God is always looking at us, because we are in the Son and he is in us. And there's this weird thing going on where we're in Jesus and he is in us. So that means that God is always seeing us. And there's something about there. It's a seeing with, obviously, with eyes of love. It's this loving knowing that, in fact, Iris Murdoch even gets talking about that towards the end of the section on the good, where she's talking about seeing and love and good, and she starts putting that all together. But I thought it was kind of odd that at the end, when she comes to the end of the second chapter, she makes a point of saying that she's not accepting the idea that there is a God. She sort of throws that out the window all of a sudden, right at the end of the chapter. All the way through, she's talking about things that seem to be transcendent, that seem to be beyond and other. And do you understand why she made that move?
I have a hunch. And let me ask you first, did you happen to watch Peterson lecture on the question, do I believe in God?
Yes.
This is one of his, yeah.
I've seen him do that several times, yeah. But the one especially where he gave it like a half an hour, yeah.
Yes, that's the one I'm referring to. And so let's put Peterson beside Murdoch, because I think their motivations are pure, and I think they're pool balls on the table very close to one another. And then another ball next to them, I think, is Martin Heidegger later in his career.
Okay, so when you get done with that, I have a very big question for you about Peterson, Murdoch, and Heidegger, okay?
Yeah, absolutely. We'll put that cue over here, and someone can put some English on it, whatever they call it when they scrape off the top of it for later. I forgot what they called that, at any rate. But Heidegger, his early work, it was late in his life, but his early philosophical work was being and time. And he made a move similar to the one theologians did. I'm going to show my card here. I think everything is theological, at least in the sciences. And philosophy, the fact that it's called philosophy and it's practiced as an academic enterprise or recreation is what they were doing in 1000 AD, just with different economic setups. So when Heidegger says in Being in Time, and it sounded groundbreaking then, what is thought-provoking in these thought-provoking times is we still are not thinking. And then, so he wanted to say, there are beings, zoologically there are animals out there, and we're comfortable slicing them into genuses and species. We do it with microbes, we do it with race, but why don't we do it with being? Wow, Heidegger is capitalizing the B, what Peterson does. There's being and then there's being. And Michael would have more to say about this, but the romanticists and the idealists, they would talk about a higher order perception that got you to the totality of things and the parts disappeared, as if there was capital B being out there, that all these other beings just don't depict. They might relate in some offshoot fashion. Plato, maybe when he was talking about a horse, but then the form of the horse, he was going after this capital B being. And Heidegger thought, well, we never stop to consider what being is, so when we think, we're not actually thinking what is. We're doing something else, right? We're repeating propaganda, we're making art, we're expressing ourselves, but we're not scientifically investigating the things we purport to be scientifically investigating, because we're not asking fundamental questions. We're not capitalizing the B. And then, but he said we don't do this because we don't know how. And since we don't know how, we cannot. And since we cannot, if we're going to be honest, then it is nothing to us. It's forever in the hole on the pool in the pool table. It never comes out to play.
So is that part of why Iris Murdoch calls Heidegger Luciferian?
That's a good question. I don't know. What do you think? I honestly don't know.
I have no idea. I was kind of shocked when I ran into that quote when she said, when she put Heidegger in the Luciferian camp.
So I'll admit to you, I didn't read that second chapter because I thought we were going to do the up to 45.
Oh, okay. Well,
so that's fine.
I'll just read this to you. She says,
yes, please.
I have suggested that moral philosophy needs a new and, to my mind, more realistic, less romantic terminology if it is to rescue thought about human destiny from a scientifically minded empiricism which is not equipped to deal with the real problems. Linguistic philosophy has already begun to join hands with such an empiricism, and most existentialist thinking seems to me either optimistic romancing or else something positively Luciferian. Parentheses.
I mean,
Heidegger is Lucifer in person.
I hear in that argumentation, in that cadence of the way she's writing those sentences, the move of there are beings out there in the world, but what is capital B being? What is the superstructure, as Descartes would say? We don't know how to slice up being, and therefore we must be agnostic to what is, because we don't know how to interrogate being. We can kill animals all day, open them up, look at their organs, and say we understand evolution. But
there's no
what is it to be?
No empirical way to analyze being.
Exactly. And it's sort of like, I don't know if it's a rigorous move, but it's a sleight of hand, as Peterson would say, right? Like he talked about the Marxist having the Foucaultians or the Marxists, I don't remember which, having a sleight of hand for the other to bring the other in without doing full justice to their independent philosophies. There's a sleight of hand of, we can talk about the organs by putting little stainless steel sticks in them and calling it an intestine, old tract. And we have to make you repeat after me or you don't get to become a doctor in the society. But have we moved 1 inch towards what it is to be? Where's that so I can put a stainless steel stick on it, in it? And that sounds very, to use a word from you and Michael, nominalist. Because as Occam said, do not multiply entities beyond necessity. If you have, and this is where her romanticism may come in, and maybe this is why she called him Lucifer. Lucifer didn't like heaven, the way it was arranged. He thought he could do it better. It was just missing one thing. His idea. Yeah. What did you say?
His leadership.
Yes. And that was the undoing of everything for him. And this move in philosophy to say everyone who's up on a pillar, like in the Greek pantheon, they were all irrelevant. They weren't even close. So let's destroy that. We don't need American history. We don't need, right? We're doing a lot of this nowadays, this move. We don't need any of that. They were all on the wrong track. They didn't ask the basic question. And then they articulate the basic question. And then they also articulate the impossibility of answering the question they have articulated. So they've successfully created an echo chamber and a vacuous circle that will always be vicious, but seems to be virtuous if you buy them at every word. And this is why they're difficult, right? Why they incorporate the riddles and the gnomic sayings so that you never quite catch on to the tangents.
Well, but that would be describing the postmodernists and the Marxists, right? That wouldn't be describing as I understand it, Heidegger was an existentialist.
But to your point, maybe you said it in this video or in the video with Michael, these thinkers influence like huge tsunamis off in the middle of nowhere. They're a university that nobody's heard of. We have an understanding that it's elite, but once that comet hits, years later, minutes later, that wave comes and destroys everything we've taken for granted. Mm-hmm. When Heidegger said, we have not yet begun to ask what being is.
Oh, so he opened the door to that stuff.
I would say he rammed hundreds of thousands of millions of gallons of water against the levees.
Well, so then I really have a question for you, because I've heard some people say that Peterson is an existentialist. does he align himself with the existentialists? Because Iris Murdoch puts Dostoevsky and I think even Tolstoy in the category with the existentialists. And Peterson's always talking about Dostoevsky's thinking, and that Nietzsche was a precursor to the existentialists. So is Peterson an existentialist? Then he would also be part of what opened the door to the postmodernism and Marxism. Oh my, oh me,
oh my. Lions and tigers and Jordan Peterson's. Oh my! Here's the way I read Peterson. I think he is a modern saint. I think whether he does this intentionally or it's brilliant PR work, if you look at the lives of the saints, and I mean the library known as the Lives of the Saints, you can go online and it's public access, monasteries publish them. All these 2,000 years, people have walked in the light and not in the darkness. And they've been ascetic, even if they haven't been monks. And Saint Seraphim of Sarov, for instance, left his country behind. And after he had his back damaged so that he was a hunchback by a couple of robbers who came to him while he was chopping a tree, he went to this rock after he had recovered, but he was still hunched over, and stood, they say, for 1,000 days in a row and lifted his hands like Moses without someone to hold it up for him, and prayed. Now, whether that's history or hagiography, the point, as far as I can tell, of the symbolism is to show how God can meet with grace a stripped individual. Peterson does this all the time. He's almost made a rhetoric, a rhetoric out of the ascetic stripping for the influence of, I don't know, and he does it, I don't know, the God to descend, right? When he said, I didn't write maps of meaning. I rewrote every sentence 300 times or however many times. That's ascetic. That's an exercise. And we had to know that. I couldn't eat anything. When I drank cider, I stayed awake for 30 nights. He said this to Joe Rogan. He's telling us his fast. He's telling us his inability to write and do simple things along the way to being a genius. And as was stamped on the cover of 12 Rules for Life, the world's most popular public intellectual. And so I think he is far from the injuries of the existentialist movement in the 20th century. In other words, I don't think he's a Jean-Paul Sartre, who wrote an essay, What is an Existentialist, during World War II. I think he is a becoming saint. And I love it, if this were true, as someone who says, I can't bring myself to say I believe in God, but I act as if he exists. Like, I think there's such a pretentious humility that my ears at least need to hear. And for some reason I can meditate on for quite a long time. So I think we're in the midst of a powerful work.
Well, I certainly have some feelings about his I would say that the power of his story is similar to the power of the story of some of the saints. Now, because I come from a Protestant tradition and not an Orthodox tradition, one of the books that was really instrumental to me as a young believer was Fox's Book of Martyrs, which was reading the story of those who were being persecuted and for what they believed, oftentimes being persecuted by the hierarchy and the institutional church. but they gave their lives oftentimes tied to a stake and burned at the stake or something like that. But there's such a power in their lives and in the truth that they spoke and in the courage that they exhibited, but it wasn't a courage that came from themselves. It was a courage that came from outside themselves. And that's kind of what I see in his life. I see that kind of, now he may say that the courage comes simply because of what he learned about what happens if you don't take a stand with courage. And so that's what grounds him. But he also says that what led him on this quest was a question. And it's that question that drove him to all of the study that he's done and drove him to all of the analysis that he did to write maps of meaning and drove him to all of the teaching that he did to try to make that enormously complex book accessible to his students. So he distilled it down into those really excellent lectures. And there's a power that's acting there, and there's a power acting on his behalf that is not coming from him. Now, whether that means he's a saint or not, I have no idea.
And I don't either. I grasp for words.
Yeah, it does mean that God, I think God is using him, if I can use that word. I mean, one of the things I find really interesting about all this is that Iris Murdoch also talks about the real and the good and love, and uses them in ways that make them almost all the same thing.
Mm.
I'll round some of them up and send you the quotes. I've got them underlined, but I can't grab them right this minute because there's just too much text here. But I've thought about that a lot too, that reality does not exhaust God. Just as you said that the mind does not exhaust subjectivity, right? But I really think that reality is certainly part of God. He's the whole show. He created it all. So the reality that we dwell in is a part of God. So, and God is love. And certainly when we confront reality in a way that exposes our failures to us, that exposes our error to us. I really like that conversation that Jordan Peterson had with Roger Scruton, because he said, when you come to the limits of your knowledge and you come right to the edge of error, that's where you meet the transcendent, because you meet the transcendent at the limit of your knowledge. And so there is some way in which reality and truth and love are all one of the ways in which we can see God. We can see some aspect of God there. And reality acts with love, because even though you might say, oh man, it whacked me up the side of the head with a 2x4 when that happened, Yeah, but there was a purpose in that, because that saves me for the next moment, that I don't do that thing again, or it teaches me something about myself so that I get on a better path. So even when reality seems cruel, it's actually a loving hand that is meting out this truth to me so that I can live, and that I have an opportunity to meet him. He's always reaching out to meet us. And, it's only, like you said, our own closing ourselves off, our own regret or fear or self-judgment or pride that keeps us. I will always remember the day that my father came to Christ. He was 72 years old, and it was only a month before he died. But he said, I have wanted this for years. but it was my pride that kept me from it. He knew that. He could see it. And I've had that conversation with other people. I've had that conversation with people who have not made that decision, who have told me, I have too much pride to make that decision. Because it means putting your life in someone else's hands. And that means saying, I am not enough by myself.
There's a phrase from Saint Symeon. I keep quoting him because this book, and this relates to the sovereignty of the good. And after this, I want to hear what you wanted to say about Heidegger.
Oh no, that was my question about why she said, why is he Luciferian?
These hymns are what Peterson's personality lectures do. They were Peterson then, I believe. Like the form of, here's 60 minutes, 30 students, captive audience. The subject is psychology, but here we go. Strip off the psychology, strip off the captive audience, take away the projector. It's not U of T anymore. What is he doing? He's reading sentences, he's quoting past icons, historical figures, Dante's, he's quoting art, symbology. And then he's saying this is what it means or how to read it, and this is how it should make you sober, it should make you alert, it should make you think twice. And he's doing that, this guy, with Greek philosophers. So take away the label of saint, take away the label of professor, and I see two naked human beings in harmony. Why did I bring that up? To say this. He talks about the cover is Divine Eros. So Eros, erotic, 50 Shades of Grey, and books like that have ruined the notion for us of Eros. But Eros is in communion. If someone's a virgin, they can intellectually commune or spiritually commune. Married people, their flesh literally communes. And this closeness, regardless of the topology of 2020, 995 AD, or sitting in a boat with the incarnated God, there was still this all too human misunderstanding, fear of exposure, and yet hunger that's deeper than everything, to be close to God, so close that he remembers us, even though we were not before the world was, to get behind him again where he is and defy, this sounds very cliche, gravity. That man uses in the first hymn, after he talks about the sun giving off this light, it is not itself. The star, he makes this argument. All right, if we're going to think of God, we have to remember his essence is in darkness. And I think this is where Heidegger learned it from, because this was happening in 1000. Heidegger said, we don't know being. We don't know what it is to be. That animal over there, you say it is, but where? Where is the is on that tiger? Is it in the second stripe, the fourth? Is it in the right paw or the left? Where is the is? You're just naming parts. Well, in 1000 AD, St. Symeon said, okay, the star, the light from the sun, that's the effect. That's the energy of the star. It's not what the star is. The star is darkness. If the star was light, we wouldn't see it. It's by this thing we call light that we see there is a star. So too with God's essence. We have all these works, all this love, but it's not God. God's beyond being. He is not. Makes people start to tremble, because then there's a sense in which no one can be an atheist, because even their nothing is an apt description for God. And so it goes from that analogy to, here's a fireplace. If you put a stick in it, you've separated flame from flame, but you haven't diminished. You haven't taken the essence and put it on this other stick. You've separated without dividing. When you speak a word, where's the word? It's everywhere, because you can't pin it down. And so there's this, we know without, and this is Petersonian, we know, we just don't know how to say it, or we've forgotten how to say it, that we are kind of infinite. We act as if we are. We speak to one another. We don't ever stop one another and say, where is the word now? And all that to say, when he talks about progress and ascent and getting better, he uses this curious paradox. He says, and this is where exposure becomes very scary, but also where the promise of Eros becomes almost too intense. He calls it an abyss of progress. So you can't see the light of the star. You can't see the essence of the star. When we die and go into this wherever, which he says, after you strip away all the parts of the universe, you have this clear, clean air. Okay, my mind's tracking with that. What's after the clean air? He says it's a receptacle. And the receptacle is the all. And the all is God. And I don't know how he does it, but he almost anticipates like a mathematical concept you would bring up of a hypercube, where everywhere you look, there's a tunnel. And if you jump down the tunnel, it never ends. And you're alone in this thing. And there's no escape. And you're alone in it. That would be hell. Unless you knew it was God. And so there's progress, unending progress, but it's an abyss of progress. And that really like made me think, my God. So when Jesus was walking on the earth and talking to blind, maimed, illiterate, he knew there was this infinite that we were all going to be lost in someday as spirits. How did he make us aware? He chose soil and birds and lilies. And yet there's this pristine emptiness. It really it made me shudder.
So what I hear you saying from the beginning until now is, and maybe I'm misunderstanding it, is that at least in the Orthodox experience that you're involved in right now, that we don't have a physical body after death?
I don't know. Like they don't say yes or no, but they
because you said
believe in the
at the very beginning about soul, only soul without a body.
Yeah. So I'm not an expert on this or anything like that. I'm still in my catechumenate.
Who is?
But yeah, exactly. But
there are no experts on this.
Precisely. But to be clear, we do have the resurrection. So God forbid, I hope it doesn't come too early or too late. I pass on, I give up the ghost. I'm not inanimate. I'm not annihilated. I go to God. And my body doesn't go there because my loved ones put it in the ground. Someday, the body will be resurrected without the taint of sin, and it will be what it should be, and it will be a pleasure beyond compare for my soul to re-enter. And you can't get out of it. We will be embodied forever. But between then and then, the soul is in a state with God, and it can be prayed to, and it can interact. But now that sounds paranormal. And the only thing I wanted to do with it was to use the Lazarus and the rich man parable to put flesh on these abstractions. Lazarus' body was nothing to be envied. Sores, dogs were licking him only for the pus. And then when he died, what state was he in? Oh my God, he was in bliss. Right next to Abraham on his chest. Eros. It was this non-sexual closeness that he never had in life. the man who had sumptuous dinners. He was always eating the finest. Like, he was a hedonist. He was probably a progressive egalitarian or equalitarian
Epicurean.
too. Thank you, Epicurean. But when his body was put in the ground by his loved ones or his enemies, his state was in fire. And I think what the Orthodox ask everyone to consider is the possibility that those flames in Abraham's heaving bosom are not different, essentially. But the experience of the one true reality differs because of the state the soul is in.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes sense to me on a certain level. Like, if I go into an empty field.
That makes sense to me too.
Yeah. I don't think I could survive in an empty field for long, because I'd be confronted with all my inadequacies. And so this beautiful expanse of nature would be like hell. And if my phone was dead, I would start freaking out. But to someone who's trained themselves, they can wander in that field and they know God. In that moment, they're in bliss. And yet it's the same reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've heard that concept before. I'm pretty sure C.S. Lewis talks about that. Maybe not exactly like that, but certainly the idea that in The Great Divorce, have you read that little book?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's been a while, but I have. I loved it.
When they go on their holiday to heaven, maybe one of them on the whole busload, maybe only one of them decides to stay. For the others, it's just too real. They don't want that. They're much more comfortable carrying their own load around and dealing with their own stuff and not wanting to enter into the joy.
And that's why I think you're right. You're right on the money when you say we have to act, because maybe then with this life, we're supposed to do all these experiments, subject ourselves to danger and new ideas and mistakes, so that when reality comes, we're not blindsided. So maybe that's another reason why we're not supposed to judge anyone for anything. So maybe Heidegger is a saint. I have no idea. Maybe he'll be canonized someday, and he's the opposite of Lucifer. And his way of testing himself, testing his reality principle for the infinite, was to say, we have not even asked what it is to be. And spending all this time making a cockamamie language that still don't know how to read in the original German for being in time. And maybe that's Peterson's, like, when he was crying on stage and when he could barely get through interviews, maybe that was him reality testing as well. Whereas for another person, they don't have to do those things, but just enjoying what they have to enjoy without excuse. Maybe that's their reality testing. So when I was 22, I judged all the time. And I'm not good at this at all, but I'm trying to not pass judgment. Like those people at Cap Hill, maybe they were reality testing. The lady who wrote White Fragility, she's reality testing. For her, God is white, the white, or it's Satan, and we need to be aware of whiteness. Well, like who am I to judge? I'm using one word, she's using another. I don't know her heart. I might be a wolf in sheep's clothing for all I know, until I really test the reality. It's Peterson's, I might have been a Nazi guard if I was born a century earlier ago. So it's, yeah.
Well, so I sense a little bit of a danger point there, because yes, we are not to judge others, but we are still called to be discerning. So
Absolutely.
So there's a needle that has to be threaded there, and maybe we could have that for a conversation for another time.
Yeah, it's a good cliffhanger.
Yeah, I do think that's a really important issue. And part of the reason I think that is that I think it gets too easy to say, well, I can't judge anybody, and so therefore everything's okay. That's a pit you can fall into. That's not the abyss of progress of ascent towards God. That's another descent altogether, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to choose. We have to make decisions, and we have to make those decisions based on our conception of the highest possible good, and we have to have our eyes cleansed in the best way possible to see the highest possible good, so that we don't mistake false compassion that actually damages people for the highest possible good. I mean, sometimes I look at it this way. In one way, being a Christian is very, very simple. Just stay as close to Jesus as you can. In another way, it's very, very complex, because you're always kind of on this knife edge. And the knife edge is a path that's going through the paint pots at Yellowstone National Park. And on either side, there's pools of hot, colorful lava. and if you just wander off the path, you're going to fall in one of those pots, because there's a lot of complexity in the world. And so, but the way through is to just stay as close to Jesus as you can. So maybe that's a good place to wind it up, and think about judgment and discernment next time.
Yeah. Hey, can't wait. Should we do that second chapter then? I'll have read it as maybe a backdrop to the judgment and discernment, and then whatever else the 5 days. I feel
really bad that we had a miscommunication there, but because there was some left to talk about in the first chapter, but I had also thought you were going to read the second chapter, and I kind of got into it. Second chapter is way easier to understand than the first chapter. So
I look forward to it. I'll read it, and then whatever happens on Friday, if we should talk again, then will happen on Friday. I look forward to it.
Okay, sounds good, Matt. Thank you so much. Hey, what about your book? You're writing a novel, or are you writing a book of philosophy?
Well, we'll see what it turns out to be, but I'm committed. I gave it a 6-month. Is it 6 months for a child to be ready, or is it 9? 9 months. Oh, so it might end up being 9. That's the metaphor I'm using. But I separated the cells of the 2 characters yesterday, literally, and it's going to be a romance of a man and woman. And he, allegorically, the insight into his world is he is immortal life, and she is unconditional love. So I'm asking through these avatars of the romance genre, what is it for life to meet love, and for the life to be immortal and the love to be unconditional? And why does immortal life require unconditional love in order to live with itself forever? And vice versa, why does unconditional love require immortal life in order to be or do, whichever comes first? And his name is Damien, and her name is Phoenix. And I got that through a coworker who's been writing baby names for years, and she had her reasons why, and I didn't have any character names. I called them X and Y, and I opened myself to the world. And she said, because apparently I can't keep my mouth shut, and it was through the bureaucratic grapevine and in the different cubicles that people found out I'm working on a book. And as she was training me, she looked over her shoulder and said, "So, what's it about?" And then I told her it's about X and Y, and she said, "I've been thinking about these names for years." And then she told me who they were and their characteristics, and I just looked up and said, "Thank you." Yeah, it's true.
Well, okay, you'll have to give us little updates as you go along.
Certainly.
Okay, sounds good, Matt. Have a great week.
Thanks. You too, Karen.
Bye-bye.